It was supposed to be a quiet morning at the ranch, a place I had nurtured and called home for years. My modest cabin sat nestled among towering pines and sprawling fields, a sanctuary away from the noise of the world. Little did I know that within 30 minutes my peace would be shattered by a phone call that set off a chain of events I never anticipated. The day started like any other, a slow cup of coffee, the crisp scent of fresh air, and plans to do some maintenance around the property. Suddenly I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. I stepped outside just in time to see two police cruisers and a handful of people I immediately recognized as HOA representatives pull up near my cabin. My heart raced. What was going on? Before I could approach, a woman I quickly came to think of as HOA Karen stepped forward, her expression fierce and unyielding. She had already dialed the police and, without warning, demanded that my cabin be torn down immediately. The police officers looked as confused as I was. They exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Sir, can you explain the situation?" one of them asked. I did, calmly but firmly, explaining that the cabin was on my private ranch and that I owned the land outright. I showed them my deeds and property documents right there on the spot. But HOA Karen wasn't having it. She insisted that the cabin violated HOA rules and that it stood on HOA land, which meant it had to come down, now. The tension mounted. Neighbors gathered, whispering anxiously. I was stunned. How could this happen? How could the HOA claim authority to tear down a structure on my own property? Was this a mistake, or something more deliberate? The officers, caught between enforcing the law and responding to the HOA's complaint, tried to mediate. After a brief discussion, they told the HOA representatives they couldn't simply order a demolition without a court order. Yet, the damage was done. The fear, confusion, and threat of immediate action had unsettled me deeply. That day marked the beginning of a complicated emotional battle that would test my rights, challenge assumptions about ownership, and expose the limits of HOA power. Reflecting on the incident, I realized how little many people, myself included, understand about property law, HOA boundaries, and the real authority these associations wield. The term homeowners association often conjures images of neighborhood rule books and fines, but I quickly learned the implications could be much more serious. The confrontation wasn't just about a cabin. It was about who controls land, who gets to make decisions, and how misunderstandings, or worse, abuse, can escalate into threats against one's home. I knew I had to act fast, not just to protect my cabin, but to understand what was really happening behind the scenes. Why did the HOA think they could tear down my property on their say-so? Was there some confusion about land ownership? Were there hidden rules buried in the fine print? Most importantly, how could I stand up for my rights when even the police seemed unsure of the boundaries? That day, I learned that ownership isn't always as straightforward as a deed in your hand, especially when dealing with powerful entities like HOAs. The line between private property and community land can blur, and when it does, homeowners can find themselves caught in a nightmare. The chapter closed on that first chaotic morning, but the real story, the legal battles, the neighborhood fallout, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. After the unsettling confrontation with the HOA and the police at my ranch cabin, the pressing question haunted me. How could the HOA claim authority over my land? To unravel this, I dove deep into the tangled web of property ownership, HOA covenants, and legal documents that govern our neighborhood. At first glance, it seemed straightforward. I had purchased my ranch and the cabin on it with a clear deed from the county recorder's office. The parcel was registered under my name, and property taxes were paid promptly each year. I had always assumed that meant the land was mine, Full stop. But HOAs operate on a different plane. Their authority is based not just on ownership, but on recorded covenants, conditions, and restrictions, often called CC and RS, that can impose strict rules on what homeowners can do with their property. These legal documents, recorded alongside property deeds, are designed to maintain community standards but can also create complex, sometimes surprising, limits on owners. Determined to get clarity, I requested a full title report and legal survey of my property and the surrounding HOA land. What I found was startling. The HOA's property boundaries overlapped with parts of my ranch, specifically the parcel where my cabin stood. Apparently, when the HOA was established decades ago, the land was divided and subdivided with certain areas designated as common land or HOA-owned land. Due to an ambiguous boundary line on the official plat map, the HOA claimed ownership of the small strip of land where my cabin sat. This was not something I had been aware of during the purchase, nor was it made clear in any documentation provided at closing. The HOA's property map showed the cabin's location clearly within their jurisdiction, giving them a legal basis, however tenuous, to assert control. Even more complicated was the fact that the HOA held an easement across part of my property for maintenance and communal access, which blurred the lines further. I consulted with a real estate attorney to understand my options. The attorney explained that while a deed is a powerful legal document, recorded plat maps and CC and Rs can create complicated overlays of rights and restrictions. The HOA's claim, though questionable, was rooted in their governing documents and the ambiguous boundary. We examined whether the HOA had the legal right to demand demolition of my cabin without due process. The attorney clarified that no association can simply tear down structures on disputed land without court orders or clear ownership. But this did little to ease the stress. I still faced an uphill legal battle to confirm my rights. I also learned about adverse possession and boundary disputes, which complicated the picture. Had the HOA been allowing this boundary ambiguity to persist for decades? Had I been a de facto owner through long-term use? These questions needed answers. With each piece of information, the situation became more complex and frustrating. It was a harsh lesson in the importance of due diligence, thorough title searches, and understanding HOA documents before purchasing land. At the same time, I realized that many HOAs wield considerable power through legal ambiguities, sometimes pressuring homeowners with aggressive tactics rather than open dialogue. Determined to resolve the confusion, I reached out to the HOA board to request an official boundary survey and transparent discussion. The response was mixed. Some board members were defensive, while others expressed a willingness to clarify and potentially settle the matter amicably. Behind the scenes, it became clear that HOA Karen and other aggressive members had acted hastily, driven by a desire to enforce rules without fully understanding the ownership complexities. The discovery about the land ownership was both a relief and a new challenge. It confirmed that I had grounds to fight for my cabin, but also warned that the path ahead would be legally and emotionally taxing. The shocking truth about the HOA land ownership blurred the lines between private and communal property and exposed the potential for conflict inherent in these shared spaces. More than anything, it underscored the need for vigilance, legal clarity, and open communication in any community governed by an HOA. As I prepared for the inevitable legal battles, I knew one thing for sure. Owning property in an HOA isn't just about holding a deed. It's about navigating a complex system where power, property, and personalities collide. After discovering the complicated truth about the land ownership, I realized that winning the legal battle over my cabin would require a deeper understanding of the HOA's powers and, more importantly, their limits. Homeowners associations can seem like small governments enforcing rules and regulations, but their authority isn't absolute. Navigating the maze of HOA power requires knowing where their control begins and ends. HOAs are private entities created by developers and governed by bylaws, CC and Rs, covenants, conditions and restrictions, and state laws. Their primary purpose is to maintain property values and community aesthetics by enforcing agreed-upon rules. However, the degree of power they wield can vary widely, often depending on how their governing documents are drafted and local regulations. At first, the HOA seemed to have the upper hand. After all, they controlled the community common areas, collected fees, and wrote the rules. But legally, their authority extends only so far. HOAs do not have police powers. They cannot arrest, seize property, or enforce laws like the government. They are limited to enforcing the rules agreed upon in their governing documents and applicable state statutes. One of the key distinctions I learned was that HOAs can regulate property appearance, usage, and even construction if these rules are clearly written in the CC and Rs and comply with state law. They can impose fines or liens for violations, but they cannot unilaterally decide to demolish a structure, especially if it sits on private land not owned by the HOA. In my case, the HOA's claim hinged on their belief that the cabin stood on HOA land. If true, they might have some authority to remove unauthorized structures. But since ownership was disputed, their claim was on shaky legal ground. The HOA's aggressive stance was also a lesson in how power can be misused or misunderstood at the grassroots level. The board members and self-appointed enforcers often wield influence without fully appreciating legal boundaries. This is where HOA Karen came in, a figure who believed she was protecting the community but was willing to escalate matters to law enforcement without proper cause. I researched state laws governing HOAs and found that many states have consumer protection statutes and regulations specifically designed to prevent abuse of HOA power. Some laws require HOAs to provide notice, hold hearings, and offer dispute resolution before imposing penalties or ordering property modifications. Moreover, courts generally favor due process and property rights, meaning HOAs must follow fair procedures and cannot act arbitrarily. Despite this, many HOAs operate with minimal oversight, and residents are often intimidated by the threat of fines, legal fees, or forced compliance. This imbalance creates a power dynamic where homeowners feel powerless, even when they have legitimate rights. To counteract this, I began attending HOA meetings, reviewing meeting minutes, and requesting all communications related to my property. I also sought allies among other residents who had experienced heavy-handed enforcement or unclear rules. Together, we started advocating for clearer guidelines, transparency in board decisions, and the establishment of an impartial dispute resolution process. Understanding HOA power also meant recognizing their responsibilities. Homeowners associations must act in good faith, avoid conflicts of interest, and manage funds responsibly. When they fail to do so, members can challenge decisions, call for board elections, or pursue legal remedies. In the midst of these realizations, I also learned about the importance of professional management versus volunteer boards. Many HOAs rely on volunteers who may lack legal or property management expertise, which can lead to missteps and overreach. My experience highlighted how the HOA's failure to fully grasp legal property boundaries and enforcement protocols escalated a situation that could have been resolved amicably. As the days went by, it became clear that my fight was not just about a cabin. It was about ensuring that the HOA respected legal limits, followed proper procedures, and engaged the community fairly. This chapter of the story was eye-opening. HOA power is real, but it is neither limitless nor unchecked. Property owners have rights, protections, and remedies, but only if they know how to assert them. In the battle between individual rights and collective governance, knowledge is power. Armed with this understanding, I prepared to stand firm against any unlawful actions and to demand that the HOA respect my ownership, my home, and my rights. Because in the end, an HOA is meant to serve the community, not threaten its members. After uncovering the tangled web of property boundaries and the overreach of the HOA, it became clear that the next step was to defend my rights through the legal system. What started as a confusing encounter quickly spiraled into a serious legal battle, a fight not only for my cabin but for the principle of lawful property ownership and protection from arbitrary power. The first move was to consult an experienced real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. The legal framework around HOAs is complex, and the stakes were high. My attorney carefully reviewed all documents, property deeds, HOA governing documents, CC&Rs, meeting minutes, and correspondence. The goal was to build a solid case showing that the cabin was on land I owned and that the HOA had no legal authority to demand its removal without due process. The attorney's advice was clear. While the HOA might have some authority within its designated common areas and rules, it had overstepped by threatening immediate demolition without proper notice or a court order. This was a violation of my rights as a property owner. Armed with legal expertise, I filed a formal objection to the HOA's demand and notified the local authorities that any attempt to enforce demolition without court approval would be unlawful. The HOA board responded defensively. They claimed they were acting to protect community standards and property values and accused me of defiance. But their tone changed once they understood I had legal backing. As the case unfolded, I discovered the legal process was painstaking and slow. It involved filing pleadings, attending hearings, and gathering evidence. My attorney advised patience and diligence. Winning against entrenched HOA power structures takes time. One key focus was challenging the boundary dispute. We requested an independent surveyor to clearly mark the property lines. This survey showed that my cabin did, in fact, sit largely on my private land, with only a negligible portion overlapping HOA common land. This finding weakened the HOA's case significantly. At the same time, we scrutinized the HOA's governing documents and state statutes. We identified several procedural violations, such as the lack of proper notice, failure to hold hearings, and ignoring dispute resolution processes mandated by law. Public records revealed a pattern of aggressive enforcement by the HOA, including similar threats against other homeowners, many of whom felt intimidated but lacked the resources to fight back. The legal battle brought more than just paperwork. It stirred emotions. I felt the weight of defending my home and my rights against what often seemed like an indifferent institution, wielding its authority arbitrarily. Friends and neighbors showed support, some sharing their own stories of HOA disputes. It was clear this was not an isolated problem. During court proceedings, the HOA's legal team pushed back hard, arguing that their rules were clear, that the cabin was a violation, and that community interests justified their actions. But my legal team countered with facts, surveys, and the principle of due process. We emphasized that no entity, even an HOA, has the right to summarily demolish a structure without proper legal procedures. The judge, recognizing the complexities, issued an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any action against my cabin until ownership and compliance issues were fully resolved. This temporary victory was crucial. It gave me breathing room and sent a message. Property owners are entitled to fair treatment and legal protections. Throughout this process, I learned how important it is to keep detailed records, photos, emails, documents, and to communicate clearly and professionally. I also discovered the value of community support. The presence of other residents who understood the situation and stood with me made a significant difference in morale and legitimacy. While the legal battle continued, I was prepared for the long haul. Litigation is never easy. It drains time, money, and energy. But standing up for my rights and home was non-negotiable. More than just defending a cabin, I was pushing back against an environment where fear and confusion can be exploited by powerful entities. This chapter was a turning point, highlighting the need for legal knowledge, preparedness, and resilience. It reminded me that in disputes over property and authority, the courts can serve as a vital check against overreach, if one is willing to fight for justice. As the case progressed, I remained hopeful that reason and law would prevail, restoring peace and clarity to my ranch. But the road ahead was uncertain, and I braced myself for whatever challenges still lay in wait. In the tangled conflict between property owners and HOAs, it's often the personality clashes and local politics that cause as much trouble as legal battles. After the initial confrontation with the HOA and the police, I quickly learned that a significant part of the struggle wasn't just about boundaries or laws. It was about people, and in particular about the overzealous behavior of certain individuals whose sense of authority seemed to far outpace their actual power. I came to call this the Karen factor. Karen is a meme, yes, but in this story she was very real. The woman who initiated the police call and demanded the demolition of my cabin epitomized what I later recognized as the worst kind of HOA enforcer, a person who sees themselves as the moral arbiter of the community, quick to wield the HOA's rules as a weapon and slow to listen or compromise. Her attitude was confrontational from the start, and she often spoke in a tone that suggested unquestioned entitlement to enforce her vision of community standards. This woman, who I later learned was a longtime HOA board member and self-appointed watchdog, didn't hesitate to escalate conflicts with neighbors, often bypassing dialogue for threats and ultimatums. What made this dynamic particularly challenging was how common it is. Many HOAs rely on volunteer boards and committees where passionate and sometimes power-hungry individuals step in to protect the neighborhood. Without proper training or oversight, this can lead to abuse of power, harassment, and unnecessary conflict. My interactions with HOA Karen were tense and frustrating. She refused to acknowledge my documentation or my legal counsel's advice. She seemed more interested in asserting dominance than finding a solution. Her attempts to paint me as a troublemaker or rule breaker only intensified community divisions. Dealing with her required patience, strategy, and a firm refusal to engage in petty conflicts. I learned to keep communications in writing, document every interaction, and avoid heated verbal exchanges. It became clear that emotional reactions would only fuel her fire. I also discovered that HOA Karen was not acting alone. She had supporters on the board who shared her views and tactics. Together, they created an atmosphere of intimidation for anyone who dared question HOA authority. However, I found allies too, residents who were tired of the overreach and eager for reform. We banded together, sharing stories and strategizing ways to promote transparency and fairness within the HOA. One turning point came when I suggested the board implement training for members on legal boundaries, conflict resolution, and community relations. Initially, there was resistance, but eventually, the idea gained traction. This experience highlighted a key truth. HOAs must not only have clear rules, but also ensure their enforcers act responsibly, ethically, and with respect for homeowners' rights. Overzealous members like HOA Karen often act from a misplaced sense of duty, but without checks and balances, they can cause real harm. On a personal level, I had to manage the stress and emotional toll of dealing with such a person. I sought support from friends, family, and mental health professionals to maintain my well-being. The Karen factor also made me realize the importance of community engagement. When residents are informed and active, it's harder for overzealous individuals to dominate or intimidate. Eventually, after much effort, some of the more extreme enforcement practices were curbed. The HOA agreed to establish clearer complaint procedures and more transparent decision-making. The journey taught me that behind every legal dispute are real people with motivations and flaws. Navigating those relationships is as critical as knowing the law. In the end, the Karen factor was a challenge, but also a catalyst. It pushed me to advocate not only for my property rights, but for a more just and humane HOA culture. HOAs can be positive forces in communities, but only when power is balanced with respect, humility, and accountability. Recognizing and addressing the human side of these conflicts is essential to building a healthier, more cooperative neighborhood. As I moved forward, I was prepared to face the challenges posed by overzealous personalities, but also committed to fostering dialogue, understanding, and reform. Because protecting a home is about more than walls and deeds, it's about people living together with respect. As the conflict over my cabin unfolded, I realized that understanding the HOA's internal workings was just as crucial as knowing my legal rights. To effectively defend my property and navigate the challenges ahead, I needed to get behind the scenes and learn how the HOA board operated. The people, processes, and politics that dictated decisions affecting everyone in the community. Homeowners associations are governed by a board of directors, usually elected by the members. The board wields considerable power, setting rules, managing budgets, enforcing regulations, and deciding on issues ranging from landscaping standards to architectural approvals. But how that power is exercised depends heavily on who sits on the board and how well the group functions. I began attending HOA meetings regularly. The first meetings I attended were eye-opening. The board operated much like a small government, with formal agendas, minutes, and voting procedures. However, unlike public government, the HOA board answers primarily to its members, who are also homeowners, which can create conflicts of interest and divided loyalties. Board members typically volunteer their time. Some were genuinely committed to the community's welfare, while others seemed more interested in control or status. This mix sometimes led to disagreements, factionalism, and inconsistent enforcement of rules. I noticed how the board's decision-making processes often lacked transparency. Agendas were occasionally vague, minutes sometimes delayed or incomplete, and discussions behind closed doors were common. This opacity fueled distrust among some residents, including myself. One challenge was the lack of legal or management expertise among board members. While some tried their best, they often relied heavily on management companies or outside attorneys, which could lead to costly decisions or misinterpretations of HOA authority. The HOA management company, hired to administer day-to-day operations, played a pivotal role. They handled communication, fee collection, and sometimes enforcement. But their priorities often aligned with protecting the board and enforcing rules strictly, which could exacerbate tensions. As I dug deeper, I discovered that board elections were sometimes low-turnout affairs, dominated by a small group of active residents. This concentration of power made it difficult for new voices and perspectives to influence governance. HOA politics mirrored any organization. Alliances, rivalries, and personal agendas affected decisions. Understanding these dynamics helped me predict board actions and strategize my responses. I also learned about the importance of proper governance practices. Good boards follow state laws, their own bylaws, and principles of fairness and accountability. They hold open meetings, provide timely notice of actions, and maintain clear records. Some boards even establish committees to handle specific issues, such as architectural review or dispute resolution. These committees, when run well, can improve communication and lighten the board's workload. However, in my HOA, the lack of clear policies for conflict resolution and enforcement allowed for inconsistent and sometimes heavy-handed actions, like the attempt to tear down my cabin. Recognizing this gap, I advocated for improved governance. I proposed that the HOA adopt written policies on communication, transparency, and enforcement protocols. I pushed for regular training for board members on legal responsibilities and community relations. The board was initially resistant, but eventually agreed to consider these reforms. Change was slow, but these discussions opened a door to better management and fairness. Another critical aspect was the role of the HOA's attorney. The legal counsel typically advises the board on compliance and enforcement. I learned that while their advice can help avoid costly mistakes, it can also encourage aggressive enforcement if the attorney's approach is adversarial. Throughout this journey, I realized the importance of active homeowner participation. The more residents involved, the harder it is for boards to act unilaterally or disregard community concerns. I began encouraging neighbors to attend meetings, ask questions, and run for the board. Empowering the community was essential to balancing power and ensuring that the HOA serves its members. In the end, understanding the HOA's internal workings transformed my approach. Rather than viewing the board as an opaque monolith, I saw it as a collection of individuals and processes that could be influenced and improved. This insight gave me new tools to protect my home and advocate for a more open, fair, and accountable HOA. Because winning this battle wasn't just about legal rights, it was about shaping the community where we all live. Navigating the storm with the HOA was exhausting, but what truly kept me going was the discovery that I was not alone. Behind every dispute, there are neighbors with similar stories, shared frustrations, and a common desire for fairness. Building a network of community allies became one of the most powerful tools in my fight, not just for my cabin, but for all of us who felt overwhelmed by the HOA's overreach. The first step was simple but vital: reaching out. After my initial legal pushback, I started conversations with neighbors, some hesitant at first, others eager to share their own HOA conflicts. As word spread, I was surprised by how many people had experienced heavy-handed enforcement, confusing rules, or dismissive board attitudes. Many had been too intimidated to speak up before. Our community, like many others, had a culture of quiet compliance. The HOA's reputation for swift, sometimes punitive action had silenced voices. But once a few residents began to stand up, others gained courage. The fear of retaliation lessened when people realized they were part of a group. I organized informal meetings and social gatherings where residents could talk openly about their experiences. These gatherings became forums for sharing information, discussing strategies, and planning collective action. One neighbor shared how she had been fined repeatedly for minor landscaping violations, without clear explanation or opportunity to correct. Another recounted a dispute over parking restrictions enforced inconsistently across the neighborhood. These stories painted a picture of an HOA struggling with fairness and transparency. Together, we compiled a list of common grievances and suggestions for improving the HOA's governance and enforcement policies. This list became a basis for formal proposals to the board. Community allies also proved invaluable in practical ways. When legal notices or enforcement letters arrived, people helped review documents and provided moral support. Some volunteered to attend board meetings to voice concerns or ask tough questions on behalf of the group. The power of numbers was evident. When the HOA saw that multiple residents were united and informed, their aggressive tactics softened. They realized that intimidating one person was no longer enough. We also reached out to local government officials and consumer protection agencies to understand our rights better and seek guidance on HOA disputes. These external contacts provided additional resources and sometimes pressured the HOA toward more reasonable behavior. Social media became another platform for organizing and communication. A private online group allowed residents to share updates, documents, and advice quickly. It also served as a support network during stressful moments. Through these efforts, the community began to reclaim a sense of agency. Instead of feeling isolated and powerless, residents felt empowered to hold the HOA accountable and demand fair treatment. This network of allies was crucial during my legal battles. Neighbors showed up at hearings, wrote letters of support, and helped spread awareness. Their involvement sent a clear message that this was not just a personal dispute, but a broader issue affecting many. Beyond practical support, the community bonds provided emotional strength. Facing an adversarial HOA board could be lonely and draining, but knowing others stood with me made a huge difference. Our collective voice eventually led to the board agreeing to implement some of our proposed reforms: improved communication, clearer rules, and fairer enforcement procedures. This chapter of the story underscored the importance of community in any HOA conflict. HOAs can seem like intimidating institutions, but they are ultimately accountable to their members. When homeowners unite, they can shift the balance of power. The experience also reminded me that fighting for a home is about more than property lines and regulations. It's about building relationships and fostering a community where everyone feels respected and heard. As we moved forward, I was confident that with this network of allies, we could create a better environment, one where the HOA serves its members rather than controls them. The journey taught me that no one fights alone. Together, a community can stand strong against unfairness and emerge stronger and more united. The fight over my ranch cabin had dragged on for weeks, with tension mounting and the threat of demolition hanging over my head like a storm cloud. But every battle has a turning point, the moment when the tide begins to shift. For me, that moment came with the independent land survey and the subsequent legal ruling that decisively confirmed my property rights. The survey was a critical piece of evidence. The HOA had built its entire case on the premise that the cabin was encroaching on common HOA land, land they claimed they owned and controlled. If true, they might have had some legal standing to demand the removal of my cabin. But if I could prove otherwise, the HOA's position would collapse. I hired a respected, licensed surveyor with expertise in rural property boundaries and HOA disputes. I insisted on an unbiased, comprehensive survey that would clearly delineate the exact property lines between my ranch parcel and the HOA common areas. The surveyor arrived with state-of-the-art equipment and a team, spending several days on the property. They meticulously measured markers, referenced public land records, and cross-checked previous plats. The work was thorough and precise. When the final survey was complete, the results were unequivocal. My cabin was located entirely on my private property, well within my boundaries, with no significant intrusion onto HOA land. This evidence was a game changer. It directly contradicted the HOA's claims and undercut their legal justification for ordering demolition. With this clear, factual evidence in hand, my attorney filed a motion with the court requesting a ruling to permanently enjoin the HOA from any enforcement actions against my cabin. The legal proceedings intensified. The HOA, confronted with the survey's findings, had to either back down or escalate the conflict into a costly and potentially damaging lawsuit. During the court hearings, my attorney presented the survey along with a comprehensive review of HOA governance, the lack of proper enforcement procedures, and my compliance with all applicable rules. The judge listened attentively. The HOA's attorney struggled to counter the survey's accuracy or present compelling arguments for demolition. Their claims appeared increasingly tenuous and legally unsupported. Ultimately, the court issued a ruling in my favor. The judge declared that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the portion of land where my cabin stood, and that any attempt to tear down the cabin without a court order was unlawful. More importantly, the ruling emphasized the importance of due process, requiring HOAs to follow established legal procedures before taking enforcement actions that affect homeowners' property rights. This legal victory marked a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. It set a precedent reinforcing homeowners' rights and limiting the HOA's ability to act unilaterally. The HOA board was forced to acknowledge the ruling and retract their demolition demands. While tensions remained, the balance of power had shifted decisively. For me, the victory was deeply satisfying, but also humbling. It reminded me that property ownership is not just about deeds and documents, but about being prepared to defend those rights vigorously. The survey and court ruling underscored the critical importance of evidence-based arguments and adherence to legal procedures. I reflected on how close I had come to losing my cabin due to misunderstandings and overreach, and how essential it was to stand firm and seek expert advice. This chapter of the story demonstrated that knowledge, preparation, and persistence can overcome even powerful opponents. It also highlighted the value of the legal system as a protector of individual rights in disputes involving private governance entities like HOAs. But winning the legal battle was only part of the journey. The underlying issues of HOA governance, community trust, and fair enforcement remained. The ruling offered an opportunity for dialogue and reform if the HOA board was willing to listen. As the dust settled, I prepared to engage with the HOA in a new way, advocating not just for my own rights, but for a more transparent and cooperative community. This turning point gave me hope that a better balance between HOA authority and homeowner rights was possible, and it reinforced a key lesson. When faced with unjust actions, armed with truth and determination, homeowners can prevail. After the court ruling secured my rights and stopped the HOA's attempts to demolish my cabin, the immediate crisis was over. But the underlying tensions in the community remained. The fight had exposed serious problems within the HOA's leadership and its relationship with homeowners. It became clear that if the neighborhood was to thrive, we needed more than just legal victories. We needed reform, communication, and healing. The atmosphere was still charged. Some board members saw me as a troublemaker, while some neighbors were wary of taking sides. The HOA's aggressive enforcement style had bred mistrust and fear, and many residents felt alienated or powerless. I realized that to build a sustainable peace, I had to move beyond confrontation and seek collaboration, even with those who had opposed me. It wasn't about giving up my rights or allowing overreach. It was about transforming the HOA from an adversary into a partner. I began by reaching out to a few board members who seemed more open-minded. I invited them to meet in informal settings, away from the tension of official meetings. These conversations were candid and sometimes uncomfortable. We acknowledged past mistakes on both sides, mistakes of communication, assumption, and sometimes arrogance. I proposed a series of concrete reforms aimed at increasing transparency and fairness. Clearer communication channels. The HOA needed to improve how it informs residents about meetings, rules, and enforcement actions. I suggested regular newsletters, better email alerts, and an updated website with accessible documents. Open meetings and record keeping. Transparency in decision-making was essential. I pushed for meetings to be held openly with ample notice, and for minutes and decisions to be published promptly online. Enforcement protocols. To avoid arbitrary or excessive penalties, the HOA agreed to develop clear, written procedures for how complaints and violations are handled, including steps for warnings, appeals, and mediation. Resident participation. Encouraging more homeowners to attend meetings and run for the board would help balance power and bring fresh perspectives. Board training. Many disputes arose because board members lacked training in governance, legal boundaries, and conflict resolution. I advocated for mandatory training sessions to help them serve effectively and fairly. While some board members initially resisted, concerned that reform would undermine their authority, growing community pressure and a recognition of the costs of conflict led to gradual acceptance. I also worked closely with the network of community allies we had built. Together, we organized forums where residents could voice concerns, ask questions, and learn about HOA governance. These gatherings helped break down barriers and dispel misconceptions. One memorable event was a community dialogue night, where board members and homeowners sat together to discuss issues openly. It wasn't always easy. There were heated moments, but it marked a turning point in mutual understanding. Through persistent efforts, the HOA board began to implement some of these reforms. Meeting notices improved, minutes were posted regularly, and enforcement actions became more standardized and less aggressive. More homeowners felt empowered to participate in governance. New candidates stepped up for board positions, challenging long-standing power structures. While not perfect, these changes fostered a culture of respect and accountability that had been sorely missing. Reconciliation also meant addressing the personal rifts that had developed. I made efforts to engage neighbors who had supported the HOA's initial actions, listening to their concerns and explaining my perspective. Over time, some bridges were rebuilt. I learned that community is not just about shared property lines, but about relationships, often messy and complicated, but essential. This chapter of the story taught me that victory is only meaningful when it leads to lasting improvement. Legal battles can protect rights, but healing a community requires dialogue, empathy, and reform. The HOA, once a source of stress and division, began evolving into a more responsive and transparent organization. Still imperfect, but moving in the right direction. I remained vigilant and engaged, committed to ensuring that the HOA serves all residents fairly. Ultimately, the journey from conflict to reconciliation strengthened the community and deepened my belief in the power of cooperation over confrontation. As the dust settled on my battle with the HOA and the storm of conflict faded into the calmer waters of reform and reconciliation, I found myself reflecting deeply on everything I had experienced. This journey, which began with a simple desire to enjoy my ranch cabin in peace, had turned into a profound lesson about property rights, power dynamics, and the true meaning of community. Owning land is often portrayed as a symbol of freedom and independence. I had always cherished the idea that my property was mine, a sanctuary where I could escape the pressures of the world. But what I learned is that ownership is not just about possession. It is about responsibility and vigilance. Rights, no matter how clearly defined on paper, require active defense and understanding to protect. The legal battles taught me that knowledge is power. Understanding property boundaries, governing documents, and local laws was critical to safeguarding my home. Without that foundation, I could have lost everything. But knowledge alone is not enough. It must be paired with courage to stand up against intimidation and unjust authority. The HOA's initial overreach revealed how power can be misused, especially when oversight is lacking. Volunteer boards, though well-intentioned in many cases, may lack the expertise and perspective necessary to act fairly. When rules become tools of control rather than community building, the very purpose of an HOA is undermined. Equally important was the human side of the conflict. Personality clashes, misunderstandings, and fear can escalate disputes far beyond what is reasonable. I encountered individuals whose zeal to enforce rules blinded them to fairness and empathy. I also saw how easily neighbors can become divided when communication breaks down. Yet, through these challenges, I witnessed the strength that comes from unity. Building a network of community allies transformed my experience. We learned that collective action, informed advocacy, and open dialogue can shift power dynamics and foster change. The legal victory was a turning point, but true progress came through reform and reconciliation. The willingness to engage, listen, and compromise without sacrificing fundamental rights allowed the community to heal. This experience reshaped my understanding of what it means to be part of a neighborhood. It is not just about shared spaces or covenants. It is about mutual respect, shared governance, and the commitment to work together for common good. I also learned the importance of transparency and accountability in any organization that governs our daily lives. HOAs must operate openly, communicate clearly, and enforce rules fairly. Homeowners must stay informed and involved to ensure their voices are heard. On a personal level, the journey was humbling and growth-filled. It challenged my patience, resolve, and ability to navigate complex social and legal landscapes. It reminded me that protecting one's home often means protecting the community as well. I also recognized the value of empathy. Even those who opposed me were acting from their own fears, beliefs, and experiences. Finding common ground and understanding different perspectives was key to moving forward. Looking back, I am grateful for the lessons learned and the relationships forged. The fight over the cabin became more than a dispute. It became a catalyst for change and community strengthening. As I continue to enjoy my ranch, I carry with me the awareness that property ownership is intertwined with responsibility. To know your rights, to stand up for them, and to foster a community where all residents can live with dignity and peace. This story is a reminder to all homeowners. Don't take your rights for granted. Get involved, and seek not only to protect your property, but to build a better neighborhood. Because in the end, a home is more than a structure. It is a place where people come together, where respect and understanding make all the difference.